structure I want to use for our time together. It's 13 weeks in this quarter. The structure I want to use for our time together, aside from tonight's introduction, is looking at more high-level, big-picture ideas over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Right, so that'll put us into week 4, maybe week 5, and then I think we'll get more specific in terms of probably, that's the key word, I'm not yet finished laying all of this out, but what I expect is that by week 4 or 5, we'll start to look at specific cultures that we see in the Old Testament, right? Egypt, when we talk about Egypt, what do we mean? And what would Abraham have experienced? Or Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, what would they have experienced in terms of Egyptian culture or Babylonian culture, those kinds of things? Or as we look at the city-states within Canaan, what were those cultural and societal forces that the Israelites were dealing with? And then from there, frankly, I'm not quite sure where we're going to go after that. And I'll be honest. So, before we get started, let's go to God in prayer, ask His blessings on our study, and then I have some information I want to share with you. Father in heaven, we glorify and praise your name. We ask that you be with us during this coming quarter. We ask that you open our minds as we open your word, and that you increase our understanding both of the word itself and your intent for us as your people. May you be glorified in all things that we do. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so I had intended on making the next comment my last comment for the class, but the drive here, I thought this is really the most important thing I can tell you in terms of kicking it off, and it is this. I have no particular expertise, background, knowledge, study of anything that I want to try to present over the next 13 weeks. So now that you all have permission to disregard everything I say, but I want you to know that because, one, it's the truth. So there's a matter of transparency here. But I don't say that, hopefully, as a way for you to justify disregarding the conversations I hope we can have. Rather, I want to frame it as, let's learn together. Here's the beginning point of my thought process. And I'll start by asking you a question. Growing up, how many of you went to Bible school? The majority. You went to Bible school. And when you were in Bible school, what were you taught? It's not a trick question. Bible stories. I knew somebody would say that. Bible stories. Everything I want to think about with you over the next 13 weeks originates out of that word stories. And I'm going to challenge that word because I think the word stories may actually lead us down an imprecise path. It's not a wrong word, right? The word in and of itself is not wrong, but it may be a little bit misleading because our reading of the Bible, the biblical text, is actually an accounting of. These are biblical events. And it's that nuance that I want us to understand as we engage in our study over the next 13 weeks. Think of it in terms of biblical events. Now, I will tell you up front, old habits die hard. I will probably say Bible stories. Let's think about the story of Abraham, or let's think about the story of Joseph, or let's think about the story of the Hebrews coming out of Egypt. Well, again, old habits die hard. Let's just agree that whether we want to go through the precise language of calling it a biblical event or a Bible story, we're going to agree that it's the same thing. But even if we agree to that, I want us to recognize that the word stories may be misleading. Because at best, the word story may fail to convey the fact that these are biblical events. They're real-life events that happen to real-life people. And as an extension to the topic of the class, these real-life people lived in a society where there were societal norms, there were social dynamics, there were cultural norms, there was a set of cultural values that influenced all of their lives, every aspect of their life. All right, there's a context in which they lived their lives, no different than the context in which we all live our lives. So the word story can actually fail to cause us to recognize. It fails us because it causes us maybe to forget or fail to realize that these are biblical events. At worst, the word story implies that the Bible is a work of fiction. At worst, the word story implies the Bible is a work of fiction. And if you take that path, and I'll get into, there's some real dangerous missteps in making that association. But if you take that path, then the Bible becomes nothing more than another book. It's a book of myths. It maybe is a book of useful life lessons where these Bible stories somehow convey a moral that should be understood or a system for living our lives. But the danger still is there that if we consider the Bible a story, that is a work of fiction, then we completely miss the core message, which is God's love for mankind, God's proactive demonstration of that love, and God's continued effort to redeem us. So, we'll all say Bible stories, but I want to be careful, and I want to lay out right up front that the term Bible story may have some danger to it. So if we can agree on that, we're good. Now, in terms of the goal, right? What do I want us to understand? Well, I want us to come to the fact that we might appreciate at a deeper level that the biblical text represents real people that lived during real times and were active in these real events. Right? That is the difference between that biblical event versus a Bible story concept. These real events occurred in a Near Eastern cultural context. And I'm not quite sure how deep I want to try to dig into that. So far, as I've planned out the next few weeks, I've managed to avoid that topic. But the people we read about in the Old Testament, those events occurred within a Near Eastern point of view, which would be different than our point of view. In a lot of different ways. And those ways would show up in terms of cultural differences, show up in terms of societal norms, show up in terms of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, show up in terms of how, if we were to have lived then in that area, how we would think about God versus how we think about God now. And as our society continues to evolve, and as our own cultural norms continue to evolve, and our social influences continue to evolve, we should recognize, although I don't think I'll spend a lot of time on this, but I want to say up front, we should recognize that the same sort of cultural and social dynamics play on us and influence us. I mean, if you're 50 or older, if you're like me, you remember a United States that certainly seemed different when you were a kid than what it does now. Even setting aside the fact that as a kid you don't have the same sort of understanding that you do as an adult. But things are different. And we hear language such as Group A or Group B or Group C wanting to normalize something in our society. And that word normalize, there's a lot that's implied in that word normalize, because it implies that they want to get to a changing not only of what we do and what we find acceptable, but a changing of the underlying cultural foundation. So I want us to appreciate the fact that these people who lived were dealing with the same sort of social and cultural, political, artistic, educational, family, fill in the blank, context. Let's see if this is working. Stories and events, social versus cultural. We will use the word social, we will use the word cultural quite a bit, especially over the next 3 or 4 weeks. And so I thought it handy to define that, so we all know what we mean when we say social or cultural. Let's talk about social first. Social factors. The way I'm going to use that term social factors, social influences, social dynamics, is really more so in reference to what influences people at the day or in the day. People living within a society or a community, these social influences, having influence on these people more at an institutional level. And I'm going to use the word institutional pretty broadly here. But what I mean by that is things like family, systems of education, political ideologies, religious practices and religious ideologies, economic influences, economic factors, economic activity, artistic endeavors, entertainment, food. All of those things were aspects of the culture at the time, just like they're aspects of our culture today. In fact, I was thinking about entertainment as a cultural aspect, and then it occurred to me, wow, entertainment is such a big part of our lives, and the degree to which there's a whole ecosystem based on entertainment. What got me thinking about this is from my office, I actually look into the Bank of America Stadium. So I was thinking about, back up. Look into the stadium, off to the stadium where the Carolina Panthers usually practice. They're renovating the practice facility. What was one football field is now going to be 3 football fields, and there's a whole, 5,000 seat audience area, and this whole thing that David Tepper is trying to develop down there. But it occurred to me, he got the name right, Tepper Sports Entertainment. It's not a football team, and he doesn't see it as a football team. He sees it as an institution for entertainment. So expand that. The NFL, as an institution, plays a huge part in our society. How many of us stand out in the lobby after church talking about the football game? All right, we all do it. Sports in general, entertainment in general. You get the point. There's a lot that goes on with these social institutions that we either participate in or are influenced by. One more example, and I'm going to sing it so that it rings the bell inside your head, but somebody is going to get this, even though it's 50 years old. Finish this sentence. It's a jingle. Baseball, hot dogs, apple pie, and... I knew somebody would get it. Raise your hand. Yep, 2, 3. Lee, you probably knew it. Oh, sorry. Baseball, hot dogs, apple pie, and Chevrolet. 50 years ago. The reason we remember that, if we're old enough, is that the marketing team who came up with that perfectly married the social dynamics of the time, and the underlying cultural values, at least for the people they believed would buy a Chevrolet. What's more American than honesty, authenticity, genuineness, a rejection of elitist ideals, family, friendship, and hard work? We all know what they meant. Baseball, hot dogs, apple pie, and Chevrolet. As social influences, it represents those underlying cultural values. And therein lies the difference between social and cultural, as we'll use it. Social is those institutions or influences, where cultural would represent the underlying values and attitudes and ideals, beliefs, norms, mores, and taboos. With me? So there's some dynamics between those two. Belief systems adopted at a societal level, influence at an individual level. Cultural values can change over time as those societal influences change. That's why I introduced you to the term normalize, as groups seek to normalize certain ideas, ideals, or behaviors. We see that today, where a change in what is socially acceptable over time becomes a change in the underlying cultural value. These cultural values represent the common ground. It's that common understanding or the common set of assumptions that society is based on. And it's the internalization of those values, that value system, that occurs through the socialization process. So they are linked, obviously. Social factors and cultural values, they have to be linked. But they are different. And as we proceed through our discussion over the next few weeks, we'll refer back a lot to social and cultural values. Somebody go to Judges 2:17. And it's here I want to start introducing us to the Old Testament as a basis for our study of social and cultural values. Judges 2:17. Whoever has that, read it, please.
Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so.
Thank you. They whored after. That's strong language. It's if you really let it sink in, it's detestable language. But that's the point, right? It's a word chosen specifically for that point in time to represent the degree to which Israel had fallen away from God. And that falling away is not just some social factors that have been allowed to, we've become lax, for example, in what we consider to be socially acceptable, or what Israel allowed to be socially acceptable at the time. I mean, I have to believe that God, in his patience, wouldn't have liked, he wouldn't have accepted those lax social behaviors. But I know that God is a patient God, and God wouldn't have used these words to describe Israel if that socially unacceptable behavior hadn't digressed to a point that it became a cultural issue. The language helps us understand the degree to which the Hebrews had fallen away from God. It's the difference between sinning and living in sin. And that difference when you look at language like this, the difference becomes obvious. But it is meant to be an over-the-top comparison between the Hebrews and where they were as a society at the time. And then to finish out that thought, when you hear language like that, you also have to understand that while the Israelites had fallen so far away that God chose to describe them as having whored after other gods, they had fallen so far away. Eventually, God chose to punish Israel. But why did he punish Israel? Same reason he would punish us. We would say discipline. Why? What was God's purpose? To bring them back. Yeah. So when we think about the Old Testament, we see this constant falling away and being brought back, falling away and being brought back, falling away and being brought back. Right? One way to think about that is a shift in culture away from God. Discipline is applied. The culture eventually shifts back to God. And that's the point I want us to understand, right? And it gets back to the opening comment, story versus event. Events help us understand that these were real people living in real times. And as they would fall from God, God applied discipline in an effort to bring them back, right? It's all a cultural dynamic, and this cultural sort of hamster wheel that they're on. Thinking of it in terms of social or culture is not the only way to think about it, but I think it's a useful way to think about it. And the reason I chose this series of studies actually is the reason I usually choose to say something, which is it's what I think I need to hear. Hopefully some of you can benefit as well. Mark?
I think we see the same thing today as far as, there's I guess, not necessarily, we don't think of it in terms of punishment, but usually you see something drastic or dramatic happens. A war, a terrorist attack. And church attendance and people searching for God always tends to go up shortly thereafter. And you always kind of see that, let's return to our roots. Now, it tends to be a little bit short-lived, but you kind of have that people come to their senses for just a little while, and then they tend to fall back when they get comfortable.
So you're entering into an arena that I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with yet, which is a theme, right? I'm not sure what I'm going to do with, fill in the blank, but you're entering into an arena that I'm not sure what I'm going to do with yet, which is how do we approach this study, and do we leave it alone as a helpful aid to our understanding of what it meant to be Hebrew and Israelite, God's chosen people, living within the context of a social and cultural environment. We could stop there. We may find it useful to extrapolate and apply those concepts to our lives today. Neither is wrong. Like I say, I don't quite know how I'm going to handle it. I think I'm making my decision. What I'm going to do is let you decide. If you want to, if that's what you want to talk about, then go for it. But you are right. You are right. So God is calling them to a change both in an individual level and a society level at large. And it's a change in both behavior and identity. In other words, a change in social and cultural dynamic. So why is this important? We've actually touched on this a little bit already. It's important because looking at the Old Testament in particular, through the lens of social and cultural dynamics, helps us to relate. It makes people like Abraham and Moses and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Pharaoh and, again, fill in the blank. It helps us relate to those people because it helps us understand they were real, living, breathing people. I'm going to run through a list. And I want you to listen carefully to this list. And then when I finish the list, I'm going to ask you what comes to mind. Mother, father, son, daughter, brother, sister, husband, wife, president, political ally, political enemy, the rich, the poor, the artist, and the poet, the engineer, the scientist, the honest, the criminal, those who have ambition to gain wealth, those who are content to live a simple life, city people, rural people. Just with that simple list, what comes to mind? Socialization? Opposites? Well, left, right. You will soon find out my two favorite colors are actually black and white, right?
You were saying trouble or family, and then I was like, oh, trouble, no. Politics, no. You use
Society.
society, yeah.
Society?
Looking at very cultural differences in each one of those.
Cultural differences among each of those? Yeah. I imagine to a person, all of you knew exactly what I meant when I said mother, brother, husband, government official, president, political ally, political enemy. All of you knew exactly what we meant. So there was an intellectual common ground that we all shared. That's number one. Number two is that I suspect each of you had an emotional reaction to those words. Right? There's an intellectual understanding, and then there's an emotional reaction to one, if not most, of those words. And what that tells me is that we can relate. Once we understand that these are real people who really lived in their time, we understand that we can relate to them. And by realizing this, by realizing that we can relate to the people that these Bible stories are about, the Bible itself becomes more relatable. As we read these events, if the people were afraid, we know what it is to be afraid. Not just an intellectual understanding, but an emotional attachment to being afraid. If they were joyful, we can empathize. If they grieved, we understand what it means to grieve. We can share. Even though we're separated by thousands of years, we can share in their joy at the birth of their child. It is real, and it's relatable. Think about this. Think about the book of Joshua, for example. The book of Joshua, initiates God's plan for the Israelites to overtake the land of Canaan. God had promised them this land going back to Abraham, hundreds of years. And Joshua, Moses has now passed away. Joshua is leading the charge militarily to overtake the inhabitants of this land. And we talk about that. We talk about how God was with them. We talk about how the Israelites were given this land not because of their righteousness, but because of the wickedness of the inhabitants already, and how the Israelites were being God was using the Israelites to demonstrate a number of things, one of which what it meant to be God's chosen people, the other thing, executing his righteous judgment against the people that were already living there, on and on and on. There's a whole lot that we could talk about, and that's what we usually talk about when we read these events. And all that's good. But if we stop and realize that it's an event, it's an actual accounting of what real people did, then it also causes us, or it should cause us, to pause and think about how there must have been, even though we never talk about this, there must have been a Hebrew mother or a Hebrew wife who got the proverbial knock at the door and was told that their son or their husband was killed in battle. We can empathize, we can relate when we just stop to think that it's real. And by looking at the social and cultural dynamics, it forces us to make that realization. It forces us to come to grips with the reality of it all. All right, before we go much further, I want to pause and make some comment about what this study is not. Okay? This study is not an attempt to diminish the Bible into either being a social studies textbook or a history book. It's not. And I think to try to reduce it to that, it would be an error. So it's an application of some ideas coming from a social and cultural perspective. But it is not, in no way, is it intended to change the core message of the Bible. That God created man. God loves his creation. God desires to be in a relationship with this creation. God requires obedience as an aspect of that relationship, and God considers disobedience to be a sin. And God cannot tolerate sin. But God also understands that his creation is weak and that complete obedience is not really possible. And so God chose to compensate for mankind's weakness by choosing to accept Jesus' death in lieu of mankind's own death as payment for those sins. God will eventually punish those who disobey him, and God has always, always, always kept his promise to bless those who do obey him. Folks, that has nothing to do with anything social or cultural. There is no social or cultural dynamic to that. It transcends social society. It transcends culture. And that is the core message. And so there's no attempt here to minimize that core message. Someone turn, please, to Malachi 3:6. Here's why what I just said is important. Whoever finds it, read it, please. Malachi 3:6.
For I am the Lord, I do not change. Therefore you are not consumed, O sons of Jacob.
I, the Lord, do not change. Based on that alone, how dare I ever attempt to change the core message? Right? So I'm using Malachi 3:6 as the basis for strongly saying there's nothing about this study that should in any way be interpreted as minimizing that core message. I want to be very, very clear about that. It's not a history book. It's not a social studies textbook. Fair enough? All right, so I already told you that I have no particular expertise no academic background. Really, I have nothing that gives me any credibility for leading the next 12 weeks. That is one way of saying I realize that many of you may have particular knowledge that I don't. I'm sure that you do it. So it's my invitation to say where you have contributions that you can make to our study, raise your hand, make the comments, please share for the benefit of everyone involved, myself included. Because what I'm about to do here over the next now 12 weeks it should be best thought of as when you were in the 5th grade and the teacher said, go read this book and in 2 weeks give me a book report. You're going to stand in front of the class and give your book report. Guys, this is basically a 12-week book report. I do have some books that I found useful in terms of reference. There's some articles that I've come across in my own research and trying to prepare, but I make no bones about it. There's no particular expertise that I'm bringing to the table. All right? So that's your invitation to participate. That's your invitation to make your own contributions. And again, like I say, we will all benefit from that. Oh, I only got 6 more pages to go. No, I'm just kidding. That's the next 2 weeks, actually. Questions, thoughts, comments? Does it sound fun? Boring? Don't answer it. Just...
One thing I think we'll be interested in is taking difference of the different levels of it. I know the one prior to the Israelite nation, then the Israelite nation. From that, because the different cultures and society come from each one of those. So and most of the time, studies are tied around the Israelite side of it, and that's not really the whole side of the Old Testament. I mean, even during the Israelites' time, there's a life going on the outside of them that's just as important, and God plays a part in those. And we don't ever talk about those. We don't tell about stories about them very often. So I think it's going to be interesting. Can you really bring out that separation of differences as we go?
Well, I hope to. If you couldn't hear Joe, he was recognizing that it would be useful for us to talk about not just the Israelites, which we often talk about, but also talk about those other cultures, those other societies that they were either influenced by, interacted with, whether that's as a captive basis, or whether it was economically. There's a lot of ways one group of people can interact with another, and it will be useful. So in the 2 minutes that I have left over, here's the intent. Over the next 2 weeks, I want us to understand big picture ideas of who the Israelites were, the fact that they did exist within a broader cultures, whether that was Egypt, or if you go to Daniel's interpretation of the king's dream, Babylon, or the Mede Persians, or the Greeks, or the Romans. All of those represented not just distinct kingdoms, but distinct cultures. And the Israelites interacted with all of them. But I want us to understand big picture. The Israelites interacted with those cultures after having been called out. Right? God called them out specifically as his people. So the Israelites then, as they were called out, were charged with developing their own culture, namely being a culture patterned after God himself, and in how they interacted with all of these other peoples around them. And geography plays a big part in that, actually. We'll get into that next week. And then I want to build on that idea in week 3, actually getting back to the word holy. God tells the Israelites in a number of different places, you be holy because I'm holy. You are my people. I want you as a society and as you as a culture to reflect me as your God. And what does that mean? Right? How did Israel then play out that idea? I think we're about out of time, so again, any last minute ideas, comments, questions? All right, we'll stop there. Thank you.